Hi everyone, welcome back. If you're seeking calm, deep rest, and peaceful sleep, you're in the right place. Let's begin.
Welcome, friend, to another journey together. Tonight, you will experience profound understanding, drawn from powerful, ancient knowledge, designed to guide the restless mind towards unparalleled calm and truly restorative peace. Feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. I will share a curated selection of profound Buddhist stories and Zen koans, insights that peel back the layers to reveal the subtle art of mental freedom and emotional liberation. Each narrative holds a potent, transformative teaching that can fundamentally alter your perception of stress, agitation, incessant thought, and the ceaseless quest for external fulfillment. These aren't simply stories to drift off to, they are carefully guarded instructions, handed down by masters who grasped a profound truth many have lost. That genuine tranquility isn't found by rearranging the world around you, but by realigning your inner landscape. As the great Zen master Dogen said, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. Through the course of our shared listening, you'll discover precisely how these ancient transmissions can illuminate your path. As we journey through these remarkable tales, you'll feel a subtle yet powerful shift take hold. The clench of anxiety will gently ease its grip. The constant hum of your thoughts will begin to recede. You'll find yourself effortlessly settling into a state of deep insight and profound tranquility. So, allow yourself to sink deeply now. Let your body yield to whatever cradles you. Take one deliberate breath with me, and as you release it, know that you are about to receive wisdom that has always been here, patiently awaiting your presence. Let us explore a story about the profound difference between resistance and acceptance. In the mountains where mist clings to ancient peaks, there stood a monastery where Zen master Baizhang Huaihai taught his disciples the mysteries of awakening. For many days, an elderly figure had appeared among the monks during evening Dharma talks, arriving silently and departing when the others did. His presence seemed natural, unremarkable, until one evening when all the monks had filed out into the cool mountain air, he remained. Baizhang approached the solitary figure, noting something otherworldly in his stillness. "Who are you, standing here before me?" the master asked with gentle curiosity. The old man's eyes held depths of ancient sorrow as he replied, "I am not a man, though I appear as one. In a time long past, during the age of the Kashyapa Buddha, I served as head monk of this very mountain. An earnest student once approached me with a question that would seal my fate. Does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect? In my arrogance, I answered definitively, no, they do not fall under such laws. For this single word of error, I was condemned to live as a wild fox for 500 lifetimes, watching seasons turn from forest floors, never able to return to human form." The old man's voice trembled with the weight of centuries. "Master, I beg you to speak a turning word that might release me from this bondage." He then posed the same fatal question. Does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect? Baizhang looked deeply into the old man's eyes, seeing both the monk he had been and the fox he had become. With calm certainty, he replied, "An enlightened person is one with the law of cause and effect." Upon hearing these words, the old man's entire being seemed to transform. Tears of liberation flowed down his cheeks as he bowed deeply. "I am free," he whispered. "My body lies in a cave on the far side of this mountain. I ask that you honor it with proper funeral rites." The following dawn, Bai Zhang led his puzzled monks up the winding mountain path. Behind a cluster of rocks, his staff revealed the still form of a great fox. As incense smoke curled skyward, the master performed the funeral ceremony traditionally reserved for monks, honoring the spirit that had finally found its way home. The Buddha once said, "What we think, we become. What we feel, we attract. What we imagine, we create." This ancient wisdom illuminates the heart of Bai Zhang's teaching. The difference between being subject to and being one with, the unfolding of existence transformed 5 centuries of suffering into a moment of liberation. Why do we so often resist the natural laws that govern our existence? Zen Buddhism reveals that our suffering stems largely from our attempt to stand apart from life's fundamental patterns rather than flowing with them. The fox monk's original error wasn't merely intellectual. It reflected a deeper human tendency to believe we can somehow transcend or escape the basic principles that shape all experience. When we declare ourselves exempt from cause and effect, we create what Buddhism calls the illusion of separation. We imagine ourselves as independent agents, disconnected from the web of interdependence that connects all phenomena. This fantasy of autonomy becomes a prison, cutting us off from the natural wisdom available when we recognize our fundamental unity with existence itself. Consider how this pattern manifests in daily life. When we resist aging, we suffer more than aging itself causes. When we fight against failure, we create additional pain beyond the disappointment. When we struggle against difficult emotions, we intensify them through our resistance. Each time we say, "This shouldn't be happening to me," we shoot ourselves with the second arrow of unnecessary suffering. The enlightened person doesn't escape cause and effect, but dances with it. They understand that freedom comes not from standing outside natural law, but from flowing so completely with it that there's no sense of separation between self and circumstance. As Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi taught, "You are perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement." Both statements are simultaneously true when we stop fighting reality. Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of this when he said, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." When we truly accept that all phenomena arise and pass according to causes and conditions, we discover freedom within those very conditions. The fox's liberation came not from escaping natural law, but from embracing his complete participation in it. This understanding transforms our relationship to personal responsibility. Instead of burden, accountability becomes a source of empowerment. When we're one with cause and effect, every choice becomes an opportunity to plant seeds of wisdom. Every moment a chance to align with beneficial patterns. Tonight, as you notice areas where you're fighting against what is, can you experiment with the phrase "one with" instead of "subject to"? Where in your life might you discover freedom not through resistance, but through complete acceptance of your participation in the great unfolding? As the Buddha taught, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. The eternal rule isn't a constraint, but the very fabric from which liberation is woven. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about perceiving beauty within loss. In the mountain temple where Master Yunmen Wenyan resided, autumn arrived with its familiar poetry of change. The ancient maples that had shaded the meditation halls through summer's heat now displayed their magnificent transformation, golden and crimson leaves dancing in the crisp air. A young monk, his heart heavy with the melancholy that often accompanies seasonal transition, sought out his teacher. The beauty of autumn stirred something sorrowful within him, a recognition of life's fleeting nature that he found difficult to bear. The falling leaves seemed to whisper of his own mortality, of all the losses he would inevitably face. Finding Master Yunmen sweeping the temple courtyard, the monk approached with his burden of questions. "Master," he began, his voice carrying the weight of contemplation, "when the tree withers and the leaves fall, what is really happening? I look at this beauty and feel only sadness. Why does nature's splendor remind me so powerfully of ending and decay?" The master paused in his sweeping, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked up at the canopy above them, where leaves caught the afternoon sunlight like stained glass windows. In the distance, more leaves spiraled downward in their ancient dance, each one unique in its final journey. Rather than offering a scholarly discourse on impermanence or the Buddhist teaching of anicca, Yunmen simply replied with poetic directness, "The golden wind is revealing itself." In that moment, the monk felt something shift in his perception. Where he had seen only ending, his teacher pointed to beginning. Where he had noticed only death, Yunmen revealed life expressing itself in yet another form. The autumn wind wasn't destroying the leaves. It was the season's own nature, manifesting perfectly, completely, without apology. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, the past is gone, the future is not yet here, and life can only be found in the present moment. What emerges from this story is our tendency to overlay our concepts of loss onto life's natural expressions of change. Why do we struggle to see the golden wind when we're fixated on the falling leaves? Zen Buddhism points to our habit of interpreting transience through the lens of personal fear rather than universal wisdom. We project our anxiety about our own impermanence onto every changing phenomenon, missing the vital energy that drives transformation itself. Our minds, trained to seek permanence in an impermanent world, automatically categorize change as threat. When leaves fall, we see death approaching. When relationships evolve, we fear abandonment. When our bodies age, we experience only decline. This mental conditioning blinds us to what Yunmen called the golden wind, the dynamic force of life expressing itself through every transformation. But what if autumn isn't about ending, but about culmination? What if the falling leaves represent not death, but the tree's ultimate gift, returning nutrients to the soil that will nourish future growth? The golden wind reveals that what appears to be loss is actually life's generous circulation of energy from one form to another. Consider the transitions in your own experience. A career change that felt like failure might reveal itself as freedom to explore new possibilities. The end of a relationship that brought grief might create space for deeper self-understanding. Even physical aging, which our culture teaches us to resist, might be seen as life's golden wind, revealing new forms of wisdom and acceptance. Zen master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. When we forget our small, fearful self that clings to unchanging forms, we recognize ourselves as expressions of the same golden wind that moves through all phenomena. We're not separate observers watching life decay. We're life itself, dancing through countless transformations." This recognition transforms grief into gratitude. The leaves don't fall reluctantly, they release with perfect timing, each one a small celebration of completion. When we align with this natural rhythm, our own changes become less fearsome and more graceful. Vietnamese teacher Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. The golden wind that releases autumn's leaves also brings spring's blossoms. The same force that ages our bodies also deepens our capacity for wisdom and compassion. Tonight, as you observe changes occurring in your life or the world around you, can you look for the golden wind within apparent endings? Perhaps you'll notice new possibilities emerging from old forms, or recognize your own participation in life's endless creativity. The Buddha taught, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence." The golden wind isn't something to be grasped or resisted, but recognized as the very medium through which awakening occurs. Our next story reveals the profound teaching that exists beyond the boundaries of words and concepts. In the monastery where Zen master Mazu Daoyi lived and taught, unconventional wisdom flowed like mountain streams, sudden, direct, and impossible to capture in containers of ordinary understanding. One morning, as mist still clung to the temple eaves, an earnest young monk approached the master with the burning question that had consumed his meditation practice. He had studied texts, memorized sutras, and analyzed commentaries, yet felt no closer to truth. Bowing respectfully before Mazu, he asked with genuine yearning, "Master, what is the essence of the Buddha's teaching? I have searched through volumes of scripture, but the words seem to obscure rather than illuminate. Please, show me the heart of the Dharma." Mazu looked at the monk with eyes that seemed to see both the questioner and the question as one seamless expression. Without hesitation, without preparation, without offering even a moment of conventional explanation, the master opened his mouth and released a tremendous shout that seemed to emerge from the very depths of existence itself. "Ha!" The sound exploded through the monastery like thunder, echoing off wooden beams and stone walls. Birds burst from the nearby trees in startled flight. Other monks in distant halls paused in their activities, hearts suddenly racing from the power of that unexpected roar. The young monk stood frozen, his carefully prepared questions scattered like leaves in a hurricane. In that moment of stunning silence that followed the shout, something profound had been transmitted, not through explanation or analysis, but through direct encounter with the raw energy of awakening itself. The monk remained speechless, his conceptual mind temporarily shattered by the immediacy of the experience. Later that day, another student, curious about what had occurred, approached the young monk. "I heard the master gave you a teaching this morning. What did he say to you?" Still somewhat dazed, the monk replied simply, "The master shouted at me." This second student, intrigued by such an unusual pedagogical method, sought out Mazu directly. "Master, I heard you shouted at the monk who asked about the essence of the teaching. Is this true?" "Yes," Mazu replied with characteristic directness. "But what was the meaning of your shout?" What were you trying to communicate? Instead of providing the analytical explanation the student expected, Mazu responded with another earth-shaking "Ha!" This time, it said, the student achieved immediate enlightenment. His mind suddenly released from the prison of conceptual thinking into the vast openness of direct realization. As the Buddha observed, all things arise from mind. When the mind is understood, all things are understood. The deeper teaching here shows us that true wisdom cannot be packaged in concepts, but must be experienced directly, beyond the mediation of thought. Why do we instinctively seek explanations for mystery, rather than allowing ourselves to be penetrated by it? Zen Buddhism reveals that our conceptual mind, while useful for navigating practical reality, becomes an obstacle when we try to use it to grasp the essence of existence itself. Like trying to capture the wind in a jar, our attempts to contain ultimate reality in thoughts and words inevitably fail. Mazu's shout cuts through what Zen calls the thicket of views, our elaborate mental constructions about reality that actually separate us from direct experience. The mind that asks, "What does this mean?" is the same mind that stands between us and immediate understanding. The shout doesn't answer the question, it dissolves the questioner. Consider how often we mistake the description for the experience itself. We read about love instead of loving, study maps instead of taking journeys, analyze meditation techniques instead of simply sitting in awareness. Our education trains us to believe that understanding comes through accumulating information. But Zen points to a different kind of knowing that emerges when we drop below the level of conceptual processing. This isn't anti-intellectual, but rather an invitation to recognize the limitations of intellectual understanding when it comes to existential truth. As Korean Zen master Seung-san taught, "Only don't know." This don't know mind isn't ignorance, but rather an openness that can receive direct transmission of wisdom. Mazu's shout represents what Zen calls direct pointing, a teaching method that bypasses the elaborate detours of conceptual explanation and delivers truth immediately, heart to heart, mind to mind. The sound itself becomes the teaching, carrying more information than volumes of explanation could convey. Notice in your own experience the difference between knowing about something and knowing it directly. You can study descriptions of chocolate for years, but the first taste delivers understanding that no amount of analysis could provide. Similarly, the essence of Buddha's teaching isn't contained in scriptures, but in the direct recognition of your own true nature. 20th century teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti expressed this when he said, "Truth is a pathless land." The pathless land can't be reached through maps and directions, but only through the willingness to step beyond the known into direct encounter with what is. Tonight, as thoughts about the meaning of your experiences arise, can you experiment with Mazu's approach? Instead of analyzing what your life means, can you simply shout "Ha!" and feel the aliveness that exists prior to interpretation? The Buddha taught, "Be a lamp unto yourself." The lamp illuminates not through explanation, but through its own luminous nature. Sometimes the most profound teaching is a wordless shout that shatters our assumptions and reveals the brilliant obviousness we've been overlooking. Let us now turn to a tale about the difference between collecting wisdom and embodying it. In the time when Master Foyan taught in the ancient mountains of China, students would journey great distances, carrying bundles of sutras and minds stuffed with spiritual concepts. They arrived like merchants, with carts full of precious goods, eager to add to their collections of sacred knowledge. One such student approached the master with visible frustration etched across his young face. His traveling pack bulged with scrolls and texts, his notebook filled with carefully copied passages and commentary upon commentary. His robes were worn from travel, and his eyes carried the weariness of one who had been searching for something that remained perpetually just beyond reach. Despite years of intensive study, he felt like a man dying of thirst while carrying detailed descriptions of water. Bowing deeply, he presented his dilemma to Foyan. "Venerable Master," he began, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I have devoted many years to studying the Holy Sutras. I have committed countless teachings to memory and can recite the words of ancient sages by heart. I know the Lotus Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra. I can explain the Noble Eightfold Path and discuss the subtle differences between various schools of Buddhist thought. Yet despite all this learning, I feel no closer to enlightenment. My mind churns constantly with concepts and doctrines, but wisdom remains as elusive as morning mist." Foyan listened with the patient attention of one who had heard this particular suffering many times before. He observed how the student's very posture conveyed the weight of accumulated knowledge. Shoulders slightly bent, as if carrying an invisible library. Eyes that darted constantly, as if cross-referencing every moment against remembered texts. When the student finished speaking, the master smiled with gentle understanding. "You are like a man who possesses the most detailed map of a great treasure," he replied. "You can describe every landmark on that map with perfect accuracy, every river crossing, every mountain pass, every dangerous ravine, every cave where the treasure might be hidden. You know the terrain better than those who drew the map. You could guide others through the geography with your eyes closed. Yet notice this, you have no dust on your sandals." The student looked down at his spotless feet, beginning to grasp the master's meaning. His sandals were indeed clean, unmarked by the rough stones and muddy paths that would soil the feet of an actual traveler. Foyan continued, "Your knowledge is vast and precise, but it remains completely theoretical. You have never taken a single step on the actual path toward the treasure you claim to seek. You are like a person who studies swimming techniques in great detail, but has never gotten wet, or someone who memorizes recipes, but has never lit a cooking fire." The implications of this teaching began to dawn on the student, but his habitual patterns of thinking immediately reasserted themselves. "So then, Master, should I abandon the sutras entirely? Should I discard all this learning that has consumed my years?" "No," Foyan replied with a slight shake of his head. "You should not discard the sutras. Instead, you should allow the sutras to discard you. When you walk, simply walk without carrying the burden of how the Buddha described proper walking meditation. When you eat, simply eat without mentally comparing your meal to descriptions of the Buddha's alms food, or analyzing whether your mindfulness matches the instructions you've memorized. When you read the sacred texts, let the words wash over you like a stream flowing over smooth stones. Do not try to grasp them, possess them, or add them to your mental collection." The student frowned, struggling to understand this paradox. "But if I don't try to understand the teachings, how can I learn from them? Surely there's value in deep study and analysis." Foyan's eyes twinkled with amused compassion. "The truth is not contained in the words themselves, but in the unfurling of your own awakened mind as you encounter them. A sutra is like moonlight reflecting on water. You cannot scoop up the moon with a bucket, but you can allow its light to illuminate your path. The moon's reflection appears effortlessly when the water is still, but disturb the surface with grasping, and the image fragments into meaningless ripples. He gestured toward the monastery garden, where a monk was simply sweeping leaves. Watch him. He learned to sweep not by studying texts about sweeping, but by moving the broom day after day until the motion became natural. Now the sweeping happens through him rather than by him. This is how wisdom works, not as information stored in the mind, but as understanding that flows through our entire being. The student watched the sweeping monk and noticed something remarkable. There was no self-consciousness in the movement, no reference to technique, just the pure expression of purposeful action. The monk wasn't thinking about sweeping, he had become sweeping itself. From that day forward, the student learned to approach the Dharma differently. Instead of studying texts like a scholar accumulating facts for examination, he read them as one who listens to wind moving through pine branches, alert, receptive, but without the grasping hunger that had previously driven his studies. When passages spoke of compassion, he looked for opportunities to be kind rather than memorizing definitions. When texts described mindfulness, he practiced paying attention to his breath rather than analyzing the instructions. Gradually, he discovered that when he stopped trying to capture wisdom, it began to penetrate him naturally. The teachings started working on him at levels deeper than intellectual understanding. His movements became more graceful, his speech more considered, his presence more peaceful, not because he was following rules, but because the spirit of the teachings had taken root in his actual experience. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared." This tale unveils the difference between hoarding spiritual information and allowing wisdom to flow through us into living expression. Why do we so often mistake the accumulation of spiritual knowledge for spiritual development itself? Zen Buddhism points to our deep-seated belief that more information equals greater understanding. This consumer mentality, which serves us well in material matters, becomes a trap when applied to inner transformation. We collect teachings like souvenirs, building impressive libraries of concepts while remaining fundamentally unchanged by what we've gathered. Our culture reinforces this pattern relentlessly. We measure intelligence by information retention, success by accumulated expertise, and progress by visible achievement. When we bring this same framework to spiritual development, we unconsciously treat wisdom like any other commodity to be acquired, stored, and displayed. We become spiritual consumers rather than spiritual practitioners. The student's dilemma reflects a common spiritual pitfall, what Zen calls Zen sickness, the condition of being so full of spiritual concepts that there's no room for actual experience. We become like people describing the taste of water while dying of thirst, or experts on swimming who've never gotten wet. Our minds become cluttered storage units filled with unused tools for transformation. This pattern manifests everywhere in modern life, not just in formal spiritual study. Consider the person who owns dozens of self-help books, but continues struggling with the same life challenges. They can quote experts on productivity while their own lives remain chaotic. They know the latest research on happiness while feeling persistently unsatisfied. They've memorized relationship advice while their own connections suffer from neglect. Or observe the fitness enthusiast who reads every study about optimal nutrition and exercise, but whose body remains unchanged because they rarely leave the realm of theory for actual practice. They can debate training philosophies endlessly, but lack the dust on their shoes that comes from consistent daily walks. The psychology behind this pattern runs deep. There's a genuine dopamine reward that comes from learning new information, creating the illusion of progress without requiring the discomfort of actual change. Reading about courage feels easier than acting courageously. Studying compassion seems safer than opening our hearts to difficult people. Analyzing mindfulness requires less vulnerability than sitting quietly with our actual anxieties. Furthermore, our ego finds clever ways to use spiritual knowledge as armor against genuine transformation. We can hide behind sophisticated concepts, using our understanding of non-attachment to avoid commitment, or our knowledge of impermanence to sidestep responsibility. The very teachings meant to liberate us become subtle forms of spiritual bypassing. True Dharma study requires what Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls beginner's mind, approaching each text, each teaching, each moment of practice with fresh receptivity rather than the heavy expectation of our accumulated knowledge. When we read with beginner's mind, the words can work on us at levels deeper than intellectual understanding. But what does it actually look like to let the sutras discard you, as Foyan suggested? It means reading about patience and then immediately looking for opportunities to practice it with difficult people, rather than adding patience techniques to our mental filing system. It means encountering teachings on generosity and spontaneously offering help to someone in need, rather than analyzing different philosophical approaches to giving. When we study this way, transformation happens organically. A passage about letting go doesn't become another concept to memorize, but an invitation to release whatever we're gripping too tightly in that moment. Words about loving kindness don't remain abstract ideals, but inspire us to send a kind text to someone we've been avoiding. Korean Zen master Seung San taught, "Only go straight. Don't know mind. This is very important." The don't know mind isn't ignorance, but rather an openness that allows genuine learning to occur. When we approach teachings without the burden of our preconceptions, they can surprise us, challenge us, and transform us in ways our analytical mind never anticipated. The key insight in Foyan's teaching is that spiritual texts work on us most effectively when we stop trying to work on them. Like seeds planted in good soil, Dharma teachings germinate in the receptive ground of a mind that's present and undefended, rather than grasping and analytical. Tonight, as you encounter any form of wisdom, whether in books, conversations, or direct experience, can you experiment with letting it wash over you like a stream? Can you receive teachings without immediately trying to file them away in mental categories or convert them into practical applications? The Buddha taught, "Work out your salvation with diligence." But perhaps the most diligent work is learning to get out of our own way, allowing transformation to occur through receptivity rather than effort. True spiritual study leaves dust on our sandals and space in our minds. Now, let us explore a Zen story about the profound shift from seeking answers to embracing the fullness of life itself. In a monastery where ancient koans had been contemplated for centuries, a young monk found himself wrestling with perhaps the most famous riddle in all of Zen tradition. Day after day, month after month, he sat in meditation, attempting to penetrate the mystery of what is the sound of one hand clapping. His master observed the growing frustration that clouded the young monk's once peaceful countenance. The question had become an obsession, a mental knot that tightened with each passing day of fruitless contemplation. Where once there had been natural ease in the monk's practice, now there was only the grinding tension of a mind trying to solve what cannot be solved through thinking. One morning, after the monk had spent another sleepless night turning the koan over in his consciousness, like a key that refused to fit any lock, his teacher approached him with an unexpected instruction. "My dear student," the master said with gentle authority, "you will leave the monastery today. Go into the town below and remain there for 1 full week. During this time, I want you to forget completely about the koan. Do not think about one hand or its sound. Simply observe what presents itself to your senses. Walk, listen, watch, but make no effort to understand or achieve anything." Though puzzled by this unconventional guidance, the monk packed his simple belongings and descended the mountain path toward the bustling valley town. For the first time in months, he was instructed not to meditate on the famous riddle that had consumed his thoughts. As he entered the crowded marketplace, his ears were immediately filled with a symphony of human activity. Vendors called out their wares in melodious chants. Fresh vegetables, sweet rice, fine cloth. Children's laughter bubbled up from side streets where they played with simple toys. The rhythmic hammering of a blacksmith created a steady percussion underlying the urban symphony, while nearby, a beggar sang ancient folk songs in exchange for coins. Day by day, the monk wandered through this vibrant human landscape without agenda. He witnessed heated arguments between merchants and tender moments of kindness between strangers. He observed the hurried pace of those rushing to appointments and the leisurely gait of elders who had learned to savor time itself. He felt the warmth of afternoon sun on his shoulders and the weariness that accumulated in his legs from hours of walking on cobblestone streets. Gradually, something began to shift in his perception. Without the pressure of seeking the answer to his koan, his awareness became more spacious, more receptive to the texture of immediate experience. He found himself simply present with whatever arose, no longer filtering reality through the lens of spiritual seeking. When the week concluded and he returned to the monastery, his master immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. The tight concentration that had previously marked his features had been replaced by a quality of relaxed alertness. "Tell me," the master asked, "did you discover the sound of one hand during your time in the world?" The monk was silent for a long moment, not searching for the right answer, but allowing his direct experience to find expression. Finally, he spoke with quiet certainty. "The sound of one hand is the joy in the rice seller's voice when he makes a sale. It is the perfect silence that exists between the blacksmith's hammer strikes. It is the warmth of sunlight touching my face and the honest tiredness that comes from walking many miles. The sound of one hand is not separate from the world. It is the world itself expressing its own nature." His master smiled with deep satisfaction. The young monk had finally stopped listening for something and had begun hearing everything. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, when you realize how perfect everything is, you will tilt your head back and laugh at the sky. Here we discover that the deepest spiritual insights come not from intense seeking, but from the willingness to be fully present with ordinary experience. Why do we imagine that profound realization requires extraordinary circumstances? Zen Buddhism reveals that our very searching often becomes the obstacle to finding what we seek. Like someone frantically looking for glasses that are already resting on their nose, we exhaust ourselves pursuing what is immediately available in each moment. The monk's breakthrough illustrates what Zen teachers call ordinary mind is the way. The sound of one hand isn't a mystical phenomenon requiring special states of consciousness to perceive. It's the constant expression of life itself, audible to anyone willing to listen without the filter of expectation or the burden of spiritual ambition. Consider how this pattern appears in our own seeking. We meditate to achieve peace, while peace exists in the simple act of breathing. We study wisdom teachings to understand our true nature, while our true nature is the one who studies. We practice mindfulness to become present, while presence is what allows us to practice. The very effort to attain what we already possess creates the illusion of separation from it. The marketplace becomes the perfect classroom precisely because it's not trying to be spiritual. The vendor's cry, the child's laughter, the blacksmith's rhythm, each is completely itself without pretense or performance. They demonstrate what Zen calls suchness, the quality of being perfectly, unself-consciously what one is. Zen master Huang Po taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." When the monk stopped thinking about one hand and began seeing with fresh eyes, the sound revealed itself as the entire symphony of existence happening effortlessly around him. This doesn't diminish the value of formal practice, but rather illuminates its purpose. Meditation, study, and contemplation serve not to create special states, but to remove the mental static that prevents us from recognizing what has always been present. Like polishing a mirror, practice clears away the accumulation of conceptual dust that obscures our natural capacity for direct perception. The sound of one hand in your own life might be the satisfaction in your morning coffee, the efficiency of your breathing during exercise, the contentment in your pet's sleeping presence, or the simple miracle of consciousness itself, reading these words. These aren't consolation prizes for failing to achieve enlightenment. They are enlightenment expressing itself through the particular circumstances of your existence. Tonight, as you notice the countless sounds that surround you, perhaps the hum of electricity, the distant traffic, your own heartbeat, can you hear them as expressions of the same sourceless source that moves through all phenomena? Can you recognize that the one who listens and what is heard are waves in the same ocean of awareness? As the Buddha taught, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. The sound of one hand teaches us that living well means hearing the extraordinary within the ordinary. Loving well means embracing what is, rather than yearning for what might be. And letting go well means releasing our grip on spiritual seeking itself. Let us continue our journey with a story about maintaining inner balance regardless of external circumstances. This is the teaching of Master Hakuin and the power of "Is that so?" Master Hakuin lived in a small village where he was deeply respected for his wisdom, compassion, and exemplary character. For decades, he had maintained a reputation as a pure and enlightened teacher, someone who had transcended ordinary human weaknesses and embodied the highest spiritual ideals. Villagers often brought their problems to him, seeking guidance and inspiration from his teachings and his impeccable way of life. In this same village lived a beautiful young woman whose family was well known and respected. When she became pregnant outside of marriage, her condition caused a scandal that rippled through the tight-knit community. Her parents were furious and demanded to know who was responsible for bringing such shame upon their family. At first, the young woman refused to reveal the father's identity. She was protecting someone she loved, someone whose reputation and future would be destroyed if the truth came out. But as her parents' anger intensified and the pressure became unbearable, she made a desperate decision. In a moment of panic and confusion, she pointed to the one person she thought could weather this storm better than her actual lover, the respected Master Hakuin. When her outraged parents confronted the Zen master with their daughter's accusation, they expected protests of innocence, explanations, or at least some expression of shock at being falsely accused. Instead, Hakuin listened calmly to their angry words and simply replied, "Is that so?" His response only seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Surely an innocent man would defend himself more vigorously. The scandal exploded throughout the village. People who had revered Hakuin as a saint now whispered that he was a hypocrite who had been living a lie. His reputation was destroyed overnight, and former students abandoned him in disgust and disappointment. When the child was born, the parents brought the baby directly to Hakuin. "This is your responsibility now," they declared bitterly. "Since you are the father, you must take care of this child." They thrust the infant into his arms and walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of a crime he had never committed. Again, Hakuin simply said, "Is that so?" and accepted the baby without protest or explanation. For many months, the former master cared for the child with tender attention. He fed the infant, changed diapers, walked the floors during sleepless nights, and provided all the love and care that any devoted parent would give. Neighbors who had once brought him offerings of food and respect now ignored him or spoke of him with contempt. He had lost his position, his reputation, and his livelihood, but he continued to care for the child with peaceful dedication. Meanwhile, the young woman struggled with the weight of her lie. Watching the revered teacher suffer for her deception while caring lovingly for a child that wasn't his became unbearable. The guilt consumed her until she could no longer live with what she had done. Finally, she confessed the truth to her parents. The real father was a young man in the village whom she had been trying to protect. Her parents were horrified to learn what they had done to an innocent man. They rushed to Hakuin's simple dwelling with profuse apologies. "Master, we have wronged you terribly," they said, bowing deeply. "Our daughter has confessed that you are not the father. We know now that you have suffered unjustly for our mistake. Please forgive us and allow us to take the child back to its real family." Hakuin listened to their apologies with the same equanimity he had shown to their accusations. As he gently placed the baby in their arms, he offered the same response he had given throughout the entire ordeal. "Is that so?" As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What emerges from this story is the profound power of maintaining inner equilibrium regardless of how others perceive us or what circumstances life presents. Why do we allow external events and other people's opinions to determine our inner state? Zen Buddhism teaches that true freedom comes from developing an unshakable center that remains stable, whether we're being praised or blamed, honored or dishonored, treated fairly or unjustly. Hakuin's response, "Is that so?" represents a profound spiritual practice. He wasn't being indifferent or passive. He was demonstrating the ultimate non-attachment to reputation, status, and even justice itself. His consistent response showed that his sense of worth and purpose came from within rather than from external validation. Consider how differently most of us would react to false accusations, public humiliation, and complete loss of reputation. The natural human response is to defend ourselves, to fight against injustice, to demand that others see the truth. But Hakuin's approach reveals another possibility, meeting all circumstances with the same peaceful acceptance. This doesn't mean we should never defend ourselves or that we should passively accept all injustices. Hakuin's teaching is more subtle. He shows us that our inner peace doesn't have to depend on external circumstances being fair or favorable. We can maintain our center regardless of how the world treats us. The Buddha taught, "You will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger." Hakuin's equanimity protected him from the additional suffering that would have come from resentment, self-pity, or desperate attempts to restore his reputation. While the situation was undoubtedly challenging, he didn't compound the difficulty with emotional resistance. Look deeply at your own reactions to criticism, misunderstanding, or unfair treatment. How much of your suffering comes from the actual events, and how much comes from your mental and emotional responses to those events? Hakuin's example suggests that we have far more control over the second source of suffering than the first. Tonight, as you encounter whatever judgments, misunderstandings, or unfair treatments life may bring, can you remember Master Hakuin's peaceful, "Is that so?" Can you find the space between what happens to you and how you respond, discovering that your inner peace need not be held hostage by external circumstances? Buddha's wisdom teaches us, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. True spiritual development isn't measured by how well life treats us, but by how gracefully we can meet whatever life brings, maintaining our compassion, dignity, and inner tranquility, regardless of whether the world recognizes our worth or understands our true nature. Now, let us experience a Zen story about the unexpected nature of enlightenment. This is the Kitchen Monk's realization. In the serene mountains surrounding Lake Hakone stood a great monastery known throughout Japan for its rigorous practice and deep wisdom. Among the monks lived a humble man named Ichi, whose life would teach us about the profound difference between seeking and finding. For 55 years, Ichi had labored faithfully in the monastery kitchen, while other monks sat in formal meditation or engaged in scholarly debates. Ichi chopped vegetables, tended fires, and prepared meals with quiet dedication. His hands had grown permanently stained, his back bent from years of service, yet he approached each task with careful attention. But Ichi carried a heavy burden. Since his earliest days, he had been assigned a koan, one of those paradoxical questions that Zen masters use to crack open the thinking mind. His was the famous puzzle: what is the sound of one hand clapping? Day after day, year after year, he wrestled with this question, trying to solve it through logic, intuition, every approach his mind could devise. As decades passed, Ichi began to see himself as a failure. While other monks seemed to progress, receiving new koans or achieving insights their teachers acknowledged, Ichi remained stuck with his unsolved puzzle. He watched younger monks arrive and eventually surpass him in status and recognition. 55 years, he would whisper while stirring soup. 55 years, and still I cannot hear what one hand sounds like when it claps. The question haunted him through every chore, every quiet moment, every season of his long service. Now, as his body grew frail, Ichi knew his time was approaching its end. He had been moved to a small attic room where he could rest away from daily bustle. As he lay there, in the gathering twilight of his life, something unexpected began to happen. Gradually, the familiar weight of striving began to lift from his chest. The desperate need to solve his koan, the shame of perceived failure, the constant reaching for enlightenment, all of it slowly dissolved like mist at sunrise. Gone was the fierce desire for awakening that had driven him for decades. In place of all that seeking, Ichi discovered something he had never expected, a profound peace that seemed to cradle his entire being. The soft darkness felt not like defeat, but like the gentlest embrace. His breathing slowed, and with it, the churning of thoughts that had occupied his mind for so many years. It was in this exquisite silence, when there remained no more questions nor need for answers, when even the need for breathing seemed to fade into quiet acceptance, that Ichi finally heard it. The whooshing silence of one hand clapping filled his awareness, not as a sound, but as the very nature of existence itself, the sound that had been present all along beneath all the noise of seeking. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Cease to cherish opinions, and you will achieve enlightenment." Here we discover that enlightenment isn't something we attain through effort, but something we uncover when the effort finally ceases. Why do we struggle so intensely with the very seeking that prevents us from finding what we seek? The mind creates a fundamental split between the seeker and the sought, keeping us perpetually reaching for something we imagine exists elsewhere, in some future moment when we'll finally get it. Ichi's story illuminates what Zen calls beginner's mind, the fresh awareness that exists before we complicate it with goals and achievements. For 55 years, he had sophisticated simple presence into complex spiritual ambition. The more expertly he sought enlightenment, the further he moved from the naturally enlightened awareness that had been with him all along. Consider how often we create this pattern. We complicate natural joy with the pursuit of happiness. We obscure natural love with the search for perfect relationships. We cover natural wisdom with endless accumulation of knowledge. Ichi's realization came not through solving his koan, but through finally letting go of the need to solve it. The sound of one hand clapping isn't a riddle to be figured out, but an invitation to rest in the space before thinking begins. The awareness that exists prior to questions and answers. Tonight, as thoughts about your own spiritual journey arise, remember Ichi's profound discovery. What if the very awareness that notices your seeking is the enlightenment you've been seeking? The sound of one hand clapping might be closer than you think, in the very listening that hears all sounds, including silence. As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Sometimes the greatest achievement is the willingness to stop achieving and simply rest in what has always been present. Let us continue on our journey with a teaching about the dangerous gap between conceptual understanding and lived experience. This is the story of the one-eyed monk and the silent debate. In ancient China, when traveling monks wandered from monastery to monastery seeking teachings and testing their understanding, a particular custom had developed among Zen communities. Before a wandering monk could receive lodging for the night, he had to engage in what was called Dharma combat, with either the abbot or a designated representative. This wasn't physical fighting, but a contest of spiritual wit and understanding, where profound questions and paradoxical answers revealed the depth of each participant's realization. At one renowned monastery nestled in bamboo forests, a travel-worn monk arrived as evening shadows began to lengthen across the courtyards. His robes were dusty from mountain paths, his straw sandals worn thin, but his eyes carried the alert brightness of someone genuinely seeking deeper understanding. The abbot, busy with evening duties, assigned his personal attendant to conduct the traditional Dharma encounter. This attendant had served the monastery faithfully for many years, though he possessed what others might consider a disadvantage. He had lost one eye in an accident during his youth. Despite this physical limitation, or perhaps because of the clarity it had brought to his inner vision, he had developed profound insight into the Buddha's teachings. When the two monks met in the monastery's formal reception hall, the traveling monk proposed something unusual. "Let us engage in silent debate," he suggested, gesturing with his hands to indicate they would communicate through gestures alone rather than words. Sometimes the deepest truths transcend language altogether. The attendant nodded agreement, and they began their wordless exchange. The wayfarer raised one finger toward the ceiling, holding it steady with an expression of calm confidence. Without hesitation, the attendant responded by raising two fingers. The traveling monk, seeming pleased by this response, then raised 3 fingers. At this, the attendant surprised him by making a tight fist and holding it firmly in the space between them. The traveling monk's confident expression faltered. For a moment, he stared at the clenched fist, his face showing confusion and something approaching alarm. Then, without attempting any further gestures, he bowed quickly and left the hall. Soon afterward, he found the abbot and spoke with obvious respect and disappointment. "Venerable Sir, your representative is far too advanced for me. I must continue my journey rather than presume to stay in your monastery tonight." The abbot raised his eyebrows with interest. "Please, tell me what transpired in your exchange." "Well," the traveler explained earnestly, "I began by holding up one finger to symbolize the Buddha, the awakened one who showed us the path to enlightenment. But your monk immediately responded with 2 fingers, indicating the Buddha and the Dharma, both the teacher and the teachings he offered. So I raised 3 fingers to represent the complete triple gem: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the community of practitioners. But then he held up a clenched fist to show that all 3 are actually one unified reality. His understanding is clearly beyond mine, so I must seek instruction elsewhere before I could be worthy of staying here." The abbot listened to this interpretation with growing surprise, for he knew his attendant's character well. As the traveling monk departed into the gathering dusk, the attendant himself appeared, visibly agitated and breathing hard from running. "Where is that insolent rascal?" he demanded, his single eye blazing with indignation. "I've been looking everywhere for him. The nerve of that man! I've never encountered such rudeness disguised as spiritual inquiry." "What exactly happened?" the abbot asked, genuinely curious now about what had transpired between these 2 very different interpretations of the same event. "First," the attendant explained, his voice rising with remembered offense, "he insulted me by holding up one finger to indicate that I had only one eye. Can you imagine? Here I thought we were engaging in spiritual discourse, but he immediately drew attention to my physical limitation. Determined to remain polite despite such crudeness, I held up 2 fingers to acknowledge that he was blessed with 2 eyes. I was trying to show that I bore him no ill will for his thoughtless comment." The attendant paused to catch his breath, his agitation increasing as he continued. But the scoundrel wasn't satisfied with that insult. Next, he held up 3 fingers to rub it in further, indicating that between the 2 of us, there were only 3 eyes total. He was deliberately emphasizing our difference, making sure I couldn't forget my disability. That's when I'd had enough. I made a fist because I was about to hit him for his persistent rudeness. But the coward saw what was coming and ran off before I could teach him proper manners. The abbot stood in stunned silence, contemplating this remarkable demonstration of how 2 people could participate in identical events while inhabiting completely different realities. The Buddha taught, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are." This profound truth reveals itself in the complete misunderstanding between our 2 monks, each of whom experienced the exact same gestures while living in entirely different interpretations of reality. Why do we so often project our own concerns, insecurities, and assumptions onto neutral situations? Zen Buddhism points to what it calls the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, fame and disgrace. These psychological forces create internal weather systems that color our perception of everything around us. The attendant's sensitivity about his missing eye created a filter through which every gesture became a personal attack. His past experiences of being judged or pitied for his appearance had created such a strong interpretive framework that he couldn't perceive any other possible meaning in the traveler's hand signals. Similarly, the traveling monk's spiritual preoccupations caused him to see profound Dharma teachings in what were actually expressions of wounded feelings and growing anger. His framework of seeking enlightened instruction made him interpret increasingly aggressive gestures as increasingly sophisticated wisdom. Look deeply at your own patterns of interpretation. How often do your current worries, past hurts, or persistent hopes cause you to misread situations completely? Perhaps someone's distracted behavior becomes evidence they don't like you when they're actually concerned about a family member's health. Maybe a colleague's helpful suggestion feels like criticism because you're insecure about your performance. This ancient wisdom illuminates how our internal state creates our external experience. Both monks were sincere in their perceptions, yet both were fundamentally mistaken about what was actually happening. Neither was lying or deliberately misinterpreting. They were simply seeing through the lens of their own psychological conditioning. The story points us toward a crucial question. How can we develop the capacity to see situations more clearly, less filtered through our personal concerns and interpretations? Zen practice offers several approaches to this challenge. First is what's called don't know mind. Maintaining openness to multiple interpretations, rather than immediately settling on the one that confirms our existing beliefs or fears. When someone acts in a way that triggers our interpretation, can we pause and consider other possible explanations? Second is mindfulness of our own emotional states. The attendant might have noticed his rising sensitivity about his appearance and recognized how this was coloring his perception. The traveler might have observed his eagerness to find profound teachings and questioned whether he was seeing wisdom where none existed. Zen Master Bankei taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." This teaching invites us to examine the very mind that creates these interpretations, rather than constantly trying to figure out the correct interpretation of external events. The Buddha said, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased." This is a law eternal. If the attendant had met the traveler's perceived insults with curiosity rather than defensiveness, if the traveler had questioned his assumptions about enlightened behavior, their encounter might have become a genuine teaching for both. Tonight, as you replay conversations and interactions from your day, can you notice how your own concerns and sensitivities might have shaped your interpretations? Can you sense the difference between what actually happened and the meaning your mind added to those events? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. By understanding how our internal weather creates our external storms, we discover the possibility of clear seeing that serves both wisdom and compassion. Now, let us explore a Zen story about the irreplaceable nature of direct spiritual transmission. This is the tale of Bankei and the messenger. In the bustling capital city, where merchants haggled in crowded marketplaces and scholars debated in tea houses, the renowned Zen master Bankei had completed another period of teaching at one of the great temples. Known throughout the region for his profound insight and ability to point students directly toward their Buddha nature, Bankei maintained a simple practice of traveling between temples, offering instruction wherever sincere students gathered. As the master prepared to depart for his next destination, carefully folding his few possessions into a traveling bundle, a well-dressed gentleman approached him with urgent politeness. The man's fine silk robes and careful manner suggested someone accustomed to moving in aristocratic circles, likely a retainer or aide to one of the noble families that supported the temple. "Venerable master," the gentleman said, bowing deeply, "I come with a request from the Baron, a man of great learning and sincere interest in your teachings. He has heard of your wisdom and wishes desperately to meet with you personally, but urgent matters have detained him today. Would you consider postponing your departure by one day so that he might have the honor of studying with you tomorrow?" Bankei, despite his eagerness to reach the next temple where students awaited him, recognized the genuine need in the request. The path of a teacher required flexibility and compassion, even when inconvenient. "Of course," he replied simply, "I shall remain one more day." The master unpacked his bundle and settled back into the temple quarters, spending the evening in quiet meditation and preparation for what he anticipated would be a meaningful encounter with a sincere seeker. He had met many nobles over the years who approached Zen with genuine humility despite their worldly status, and he looked forward to offering whatever guidance might be helpful. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the sound of temple bells calling the community to meditation. Bankei waited in his designated meeting room as the appointed time approached. But instead of the Baron himself, the same well-dressed gentleman appeared again, this time with obvious embarrassment written across his features. "Master," the man began, his voice heavy with apology, "I bring regrettable news. The Baron was called away on urgent business that could not be delayed, matters of state that demanded his immediate attention. However, he has not forgotten his desire for your teaching. He has asked me to serve as his representative, to receive your instruction on his behalf, and carry your wisdom back to him faithfully." The gentleman paused, clearly hoping this arrangement would prove acceptable. "The Baron's specific question concerns the nature of mind itself. He wishes to understand, what is the true nature of consciousness and how can one realize it directly? If you would share your teaching on this matter, I promise to convey every word exactly as you speak it." Bankei listened to this request with gentle attention. his expression remaining calm and compassionate. When the gentleman finished speaking, the master sat quietly for a moment, as if considering not just the question, but the entire situation, the absent seeker, the well-intentioned messenger, and the profound impossibility of what was being asked. Finally, Bankei spoke with characteristic simplicity and directness. This matter of Zen is difficult to convey even through direct question and answer between teacher and student meeting face to face. It becomes all the more difficult, indeed impossible, to transmit through a messenger, no matter how sincere or capable that messenger might be. Having delivered this response, the master said nothing more. He simply sat in silence, embodying the very teaching he had just articulated. The gentleman waited, perhaps expecting elaboration or alternative suggestions, but none came. Eventually, finding himself speechless and somewhat confused, the gentleman bowed politely and withdrew from the temple. The Buddha once said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." This profound truth reveals itself in Bankei's gentle but firm refusal to reduce Zen wisdom to a message that could be carried by proxy. Spiritual awakening cannot be transmitted second-hand because it is not information, but transformation. Why do we often approach spiritual learning as if it were academic knowledge that can be collected and conveyed through intermediaries? Zen Buddhism teaches that awakening is not a concept to be understood, but a reality to be directly experienced. Like the taste of water to someone who is thirsty, it cannot be adequately described. It must be experienced firsthand. The Baron's question about the nature of consciousness reveals our typical approach to spiritual inquiry. We want to understand awareness intellectually, to grasp it conceptually, to possess it as knowledge. But consciousness cannot be made into an object of study because it is the very subject doing the studying. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The seeing itself is what you are trying to see. Consider how often throughout your day you might approach spiritual wisdom as information to be collected, rather than truth to be embodied. We read books about meditation instead of meditating. We study descriptions of enlightenment instead of investigating our present experience. We seek answers about the nature of mind instead of directly examining what we call mind right now. Zen Master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." This paradox points to the heart of why spiritual transmission requires direct engagement. The self that wants to understand Buddhism intellectually is the very construction that must be seen through. This seeing through happens not through accumulating knowledge, but through intimate investigation of immediate experience. The messenger in the story represents our own tendency to approach awakening indirectly. We want to understand consciousness from a safe distance, maintaining the illusion that we are separate observers studying an object called awareness. But awareness is what we are, not what we have. It cannot be possessed, understood, or transmitted because we are expressions of it. Bankei's silence after his brief explanation was itself a teaching. In Zen, silence often conveys what words cannot. The gaps between thoughts, the space between breaths, the awareness in which all experiences arise. These cannot be captured in language, but can be directly recognized when we stop trying to grasp them conceptually. This doesn't mean spiritual teaching is impossible or that teachers serve no purpose. Rather, it means that authentic teaching points students toward their own direct experience, rather than providing second-hand descriptions of someone else's realization. The teacher's role is not to deliver enlightenment. but to create conditions where students might recognize what they already are. Tonight, as you experience the simple fact of being conscious, aware of these words, aware of your body, aware of the space in which thoughts and sensations appear, can you investigate this awareness directly rather than through concepts? Can you be present to your experience rather than trying to understand it through someone else's descriptions? As the Buddha taught, work out your own salvation with diligence. The path to freedom cannot be walked by proxy. It requires your own feet, your own breath, your own willingness to look directly at what you have always been but perhaps never clearly seen. Now, let us explore a story about the difference between submission and genuine understanding. This is the lesson of the proud priest and the gentle master. Master Bankei had gained quite a reputation throughout the region. Unlike other teachers who filled their talks with complex philosophical arguments and lengthy quotations from ancient texts, Bankei spoke directly from his heart to the hearts of his listeners. His words were simple but profound, accessible to farmers and scholars alike. People from all walks of life, merchants, servants, samurai, and monks, gathered to hear him speak about the natural peace that exists within every person. The master's growing popularity began to trouble a priest from the Nichiren sect, whose own temple had grown noticeably emptier as his followers left to hear about Zen. This priest had built his identity around being learned, respected, and obeyed. He prided himself on his knowledge of scriptures and his ability to win theological debates. The idea that a simple Zen teacher could attract his devoted followers with plain speaking felt like a personal insult. Determined to expose what he assumed must be shallow teaching disguised as wisdom, the Nichiren priest stormed into one of Bankei's gatherings. He pushed through the crowd of seated listeners, his robes billowing dramatically, his face stern with righteous indignation. The peaceful atmosphere of quiet attention was suddenly charged with tension as people turned to see what was happening. "Hey, Zen teacher!" the priest called out loudly, his voice echoing through the hall. The deliberate rudeness of his address was unmistakable. He was treating the revered master like a common street performer. "Wait just a minute. I have something to say to you." Bankei looked up calmly from where he sat, showing no sign of irritation or defensiveness at the interruption. His eyes held the same gentle attention he gave to every person who approached him, whether they came with genuine questions or hostile challenges. "All these people here respect you and will obey whatever you say," the priest continued, his voice growing louder as he warmed to his challenge. "But a man like myself does not respect you at all. Can you make me obey you? Can your so-called wisdom compel someone who sees through your simple tricks?" The crowd held its breath, expecting either an angry response or a learned rebuttal that would put this arrogant challenger in his place. Instead, Bankei smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth and curiosity. "Please come up beside me," the master said gently, "and I will show you." The priest, feeling triumphant that he had provoked a response and confident in his ability to expose whatever manipulation was about to unfold, proudly pushed his way through the crowd to the front of the hall. He stood beside the master's simple cushion, his chest puffed out with self-importance, ready to demonstrate his independence from this supposed authority. "Thank you," Bankei said with the same gentle smile. "Now we might hear each other better if you come over to my left side. Please step over here." Without thinking, the priest moved to Bankei's left side. It seemed like a reasonable request after all. "Actually, Banki continued thoughtfully. Perhaps we could speak more clearly if you were on my right side instead. Would you mind stepping over there? Again, the priest complied automatically. It was such a small, sensible adjustment that he didn't even notice he was following instructions. Banki's smile deepened, his eyes twinkling with gentle amusement. You see, he observed quietly, you are already obeying me. And I think you are actually a very gentle, cooperative person. Now please sit down and listen to what I have to share. The priest stood frozen, suddenly realizing what had just happened. He had come to demonstrate his independence and superiority, but had instead revealed his natural willingness to respond cooperatively to kind, reasonable requests. His whole argument had dissolved not through force or clever rhetoric, but through his own unconscious behavior. The crowd remained silent, but many people were struggling not to smile. They had witnessed something remarkable, not a defeat or humiliation, but a gentle revelation. The master had shown that true influence comes not from demanding obedience, but from inviting natural cooperation. The priest felt his anger and arrogance melting away, replaced by something he hadn't expected: curiosity. How had this simple man accomplished what felt like magic? How had he transformed a hostile confrontation into a moment of mutual understanding without ever raising his voice or asserting his authority? Still somewhat dazed by the experience, the priest sat down. As Bankai began to speak again, the words seemed to bypass his analytical mind and speak directly to his heart. For the first time in years, he listened not to find flaws or prepare counter-arguments, but simply to hear what was being offered. Buddha's wisdom tells us, true obedience is not blind submission, but conscious harmony. This ancient wisdom illuminates the difference between the compliance that comes from fear or social pressure and the natural cooperation that arises from genuine understanding. Why do we so often confuse authority with authoritarianism, influence with coercion? Zen Buddhism points to our conditioning around power. We assume that getting others to cooperate requires force, manipulation, or the assertion of superiority. But the deepest teaching here shows us that true leadership emerges from understanding human nature, not from overpowering it. The priest came expecting to encounter someone who would try to dominate him because that was the only model of authority he knew, when instead he met someone who simply invited his natural cooperativeness. His entire framework for understanding power and influence was gently challenged. Consider your own experiences with authority. The teachers, bosses, or leaders who most positively influenced your life. Did they command your respect through force, or did they earn it by appealing to your better nature? The difference is profound. Forced compliance creates resentment and resistance, while invited cooperation creates genuine change. In our daily relationships, we often fall into the same trap as the priest. We approach conflicts assuming we need to overpower others to get what we want. We prepare arguments, marshal our defenses, and ready ourselves for battle. But Banki's approach suggests a different possibility. What if we assumed the best about others and invited their natural wisdom to emerge? Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "When another person makes you suffer, it is because he suffers deeply within himself, and his suffering is spilling over." The priest's aggression came from his own insecurity and fear of being displaced. Bankai's genius lay in seeing past the hostile surface to the suffering underneath, then responding to the suffering rather than the aggression. This doesn't mean being passive or allowing ourselves to be mistreated. Bankai maintained clear boundaries and didn't submit to the priest's demands for a debate. Instead, he redirected the energy of the encounter towards something more constructive. He transformed a potential power struggle into a teaching moment. The Buddha taught, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. This principle applies not just to obvious hatred, but to all forms of resistance and conflict. When we meet resistance with resistance, we simply create more tension. When we meet resistance with understanding, we create space for transformation. Tonight, as you consider the relationships and situations in your life where you feel the need to assert your will or defend your position, can you remember the gentle master who never commanded obedience, yet received complete cooperation? Can you find ways to invite others' natural wisdom rather than trying to overpower their resistance? As the Buddha observed, in separateness lies the world's greatest misery. In compassion lies the world's true strength. True authority comes not from the power to make others obey, but from the wisdom to help them discover their own desire to cooperate in creating something beautiful together. Let us keep going on our journey. The following story reveals the difference between helping and holding on. This is the lesson of the two monks and the woman at the river. Two monks were traveling together along a mountain path, making their way to a distant monastery where they planned to continue their studies. Both were dedicated practitioners who had taken strict vows as part of their spiritual training, including a vow to avoid all physical contact with women. This wasn't born from disrespect, but from their understanding that such discipline helped maintain focus on their spiritual development. As they approached a swollen river where the usual bridge had been damaged by recent storms, they encountered a young woman standing uncertainly at the water's edge. The current was strong and treacherous, filled with debris from the mountain runoff, and she was clearly afraid to attempt crossing alone. "Please, honored monks," she called to them, "could one of you help me cross this dangerous water? I'm not strong enough to make it safely on my own." One of the monks immediately tensed, his mind racing through their monastic rules and the potential complications of this situation. Physical contact with women was explicitly forbidden, and he began formulating explanations for why they couldn't help, perhaps suggestions for alternative solutions that wouldn't require breaking their vows. The other monk, however, took one look at the woman's predicament and the genuine danger she faced, and made a different choice. Without hesitation or lengthy deliberation, he walked to her side and gently lifted her onto his shoulders. He carried her carefully across the treacherous current, ensuring her safety with each step, and set her down gently on the far bank. "Thank you so much," she said gratefully, bowing to both monks before continuing on her way. The two monks resumed their journey, but the atmosphere between them had changed dramatically. The first monk walked in increasingly agitated silence, his mind churning with thoughts about what he had witnessed. As the hours passed, his internal tension grew until finally he could no longer contain his distress. "Brother," he burst out, unable to hold his silence any longer, "I cannot understand your behavior back at the river. Our spiritual training explicitly teaches us to avoid any physical contact with women. Yet you picked that woman up onto your shoulders and carried her across the water. How could you so blatantly violate our sacred vows?" His companion looked at him with gentle surprise and responded with perfect simplicity. "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river hours ago, but you are still carrying her." Buddha's wisdom teaches us, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal, with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. This tale unveils the profound difference between compassionate action and mental attachment, between responding to present needs and carrying past events. Why do we often carry situations long after they've ended, replaying scenarios and nursing grievances that only exist in our own minds? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our inability to release experiences once they've passed. The first monk's agitation demonstrates how rigid adherence to rules can sometimes conflict with the compassionate spirit that inspired those rules originally. His fellow monk saw a person in danger and responded with immediate kindness, then completely released the incident. But the first monk carried the event for hours, letting it grow heavier with each step. Consider your own tendency to replay past conversations, nurse old grievances, or mentally rehearse scenarios that have already ended. How much of your mental energy goes toward carrying situations that exist now only in memory? The woman crossed the river in minutes, but the monk carried her for hours through his own thoughts. This teaching applies to far more than dramatic violations of rules. We carry harsh words someone spoke years ago, mistakes we made decades past, embarrassing moments that no one else even remembers. Meanwhile, the present moment, rich with possibility and actual experience, goes unnoticed because we're too busy carrying ghosts from the past. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish between appropriate action and unnecessary attachment. The second monk helped when help was needed, then moved on completely. He didn't dwell on whether he'd made the right choice, worry about others' opinions, or replay the incident endlessly in his mind. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. The river crossing was impermanent. It began, served its purpose, and ended. Only the first monk's attachment to the event gave it ongoing existence in the form of mental suffering. The Buddha said, "Let go of what has passed. Let go of what may come. Let go of what is happening now. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't try to make anything happen. Relax, right now, and rest." This teaching points directly to the freedom available when we stop carrying experiences beyond their natural lifespan. Look deeply at what you might be carrying unnecessarily. Old resentments, past failures, conversations that upset you, decisions you regret. All of these exist now only because you continue to pick them up and carry them. What would it feel like to set them down? The irony is profound. The monk who actually broke the rule experienced no suffering from it, while the monk who maintained perfect rule observance created hours of agitation for himself. This reveals that suffering often comes not from our actions, but from our thoughts about our actions. Tonight, as you notice your mind returning to past events, old grievances, or situations that have already ended, can you remember the wise monk's example? Can you practice setting down whatever you've been carrying unnecessarily, discovering the lightness that comes from traveling through life without the burden of yesterday's experiences? As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, only three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. True spiritual practice isn't about perfect rule following, but about responding appropriately to what's actually present, then releasing it completely to make space for whatever comes next. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a teaching about the temporary nature of all our possessions and positions. This is the story of the inn that calls itself a palace. In ancient India, a renowned spiritual teacher had spent many years wandering from village to village, sharing the Buddha's teachings with anyone who would listen. His reputation for wisdom and compassion had spread throughout the land, reaching even the ears of kings and nobles. One day, during his travels, he arrived at the capital city of a great kingdom, where a magnificent palace rose above the bustling streets like a jeweled crown. The palace was truly a wonder to behold. Its walls were constructed of the finest marble, inlaid with precious stones that caught and reflected the sunlight in brilliant cascades of color. Gardens filled with exotic flowers and flowing fountains surrounded the structure, and guards in gleaming armor stood at attention throughout the grounds. It was clearly the dwelling of someone who commanded immense wealth and power. The spiritual teacher approached the main entrance with the same calm dignity he brought to every encounter, whether with kings or beggars. The guards, recognizing him by his simple robes and serene presence, made no move to stop him. Word of his arrival had preceded him, and they had been instructed to allow him passage. Walking through corridors lined with silk tapestries and golden statues, the teacher made his way directly to the throne room, where the king sat upon an elaborately carved chair elevated above the marble floor. Courtiers in fine clothes gathered around the throne, their jeweled ornaments glinting in the light from tall windows. The king, a middle-aged man wearing robes of deep purple silk and a crown of gold and diamonds, looked up as the teacher entered. He had been expecting this visit, though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect from their encounter. "What do you want?" the king asked directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers and unquestioning obedience. The teacher bowed respectfully, but spoke with quiet confidence. "Your Majesty, I would like a place to sleep in this inn." A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled courtiers. The king's eyebrows rose, and his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "But this is not an inn," the king replied, gesturing to the opulent surroundings. "This is my palace. I am the ruler of this kingdom, and this has been the seat of royal power for generations." The teacher nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information carefully. "I see. May I ask, Your Majesty, who owned this palace before you?" "My father," the king replied, his tone becoming slightly defensive. "He ruled here for 30 years before his death. This palace was his seat of power, as it is now mine." "Ah," the teacher said with genuine interest. "And who owned it before him?" "My grandfather," the king answered, beginning to sense where these questions might lead. "He too ruled from this throne. He also is dead." The teacher paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle in the vast throne room. The courtiers had grown quiet, sensing the profound direction of this unusual conversation. Even the king found himself waiting, almost despite himself, for the teacher's response. Finally, the teacher spoke with gentle clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the ornate room. "And this place where people live for a short time and then move on, did I hear you say that it is not an inn?" The silence that followed was complete. The king sat motionless on his throne, the teacher's words penetrating layers of assumption and identity he had never questioned. The courtiers remained frozen, as if witnessing something beyond their normal understanding of royal protocol and worldly power. The Buddha taught, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence." This profound truth reveals itself in the teacher's penetrating question about the inn that calls itself a palace. Why do we cling so fiercely to possessions and positions that are, by their very nature, temporary? Zen Buddhism explains that our attachment to permanence creates suffering, because it conflicts with the fundamental reality of impermanence. Everything we think we own, including our own bodies and identities, we hold only temporarily. Look deeply at your own experience. The house you call yours, the car you drive, the job title you carry, the bank account balance you monitor, all of these are temporary arrangements. You inhabit them for a period of time, then move on, just as others inhabited them before you and will inhabit them after you. This doesn't mean we should become indifferent to our responsibilities or careless with our possessions. Rather, it invites us to hold them more lightly, recognizing their transient nature. The king's palace was indeed magnificent and served important functions, but it was also unmistakably an inn where occupants stayed temporarily before departing. The deeper teaching here shows us how identification with temporary roles creates unnecessary suffering when we forget the impermanent nature of our positions, whether as parent, professional, homeowner, or even student of Zen. We create anxiety trying to maintain what cannot be permanently maintained. Consider your own attachments. Perhaps it's your professional identity, your relationships, your health, or your spiritual achievements. Each of these is precious and worthy of care, but each is also subject to change. The executive becomes retired, the parent becomes empty nester, the student becomes teacher, the healthy person faces illness. These transitions are not failures, but natural expressions of impermanence. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." This teaching reframes impermanence from something to fear into something to celebrate. Because nothing lasts forever. Suffering states can transform into joy. Closed hearts can open to love. And even the most entrenched patterns can shift toward wisdom. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called non-attachment, caring deeply while holding lightly. This doesn't mean we become cold or indifferent, but that we learn to love without clinging, to work without grasping, and to enjoy without demanding permanence. The spiritual teacher's insight pierces through the illusion that any of us are permanent owners of anything. We are all temporary guests in the inn of existence, borrowing our roles and possessions for the brief time we inhabit them. This recognition can bring either despair or profound liberation, depending on how we receive it. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Everything is impermanent. Try to accomplish as much virtue as possible." This teaching encourages us not to waste our temporary time in the inn, but to use it wisely, cultivating love, wisdom, and compassion while we have the opportunity. Tonight, as you rest in your own temporary dwelling, surrounded by your own temporary possessions, can you feel the profound freedom that comes with recognizing their transient nature? Can you sense how this recognition might actually increase your appreciation rather than diminish it? As the Buddha taught, of all footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Similarly, of all meditative themes, that on death is supreme. By remembering the temporary nature of our stay in this inn called life, we discover the urgency and preciousness of each moment we're given to practice love and awareness. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about transforming our relationship with suffering. This is the tale of the salt and the lake. In a quiet monastery nestled among rolling hills, there lived an aging master, renowned for his patience and wisdom. Among his students was a young apprentice whose heart had become heavy with complaints about life's difficulties. Each morning, the apprentice would arrive with fresh grievances, "Master, why is life so hard? Yesterday, my meditation was disturbed by noise. Today, my back aches from the hard floor. When will this suffering end?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had catalogued every small discomfort until they had grown into an overwhelming burden. The master listened with infinite patience, but as days turned to weeks, he recognized that words alone would not shift his student's perspective. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight streamed through their simple dwelling, the master made an unusual request. "My dear student," he said gently, "I need you to go to the kitchen and bring me some salt. Just a handful will suffice." The apprentice, puzzled by this simple task, nonetheless obeyed. He returned with cupped palms containing coarse white crystals. "Now," the master instructed, producing a small glass of water, "place all of that salt into this glass and drink it." The young man hesitated. "Master, that seems like far too much salt for such a small amount of water." "Trust the process," the master replied. "Drink." The apprentice poured the salt into the glass, watching the crystals dissolve into a cloudy, unappetizing mixture. He lifted it to his lips and took a large gulp, immediately grimacing as the intensely bitter taste filled his mouth. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Bitter," the apprentice spat. "Terribly, overwhelmingly bitter. I can barely stand it." The master chuckled softly. "Excellent. Now bring that same amount of salt and come with me." Together, they walked in contemplative silence until they reached the shores of a pristine mountain lake. The water stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where earth ended and heaven began. "Now," the master said, "place this handful of salt into the lake." The apprentice waded into the shallow water and opened his hands, watching as the salt crystals scattered across the lake's surface, quickly dissolving without leaving any visible trace. "Drink from the lake," the master instructed. The young man cupped the lake water in his hands and brought it to his lips. The water was clean, refreshing, with the pure taste of mountain streams. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Much fresher," the apprentice replied, genuinely surprised. "Clean and pure." "Do you taste the salt?" the master inquired gently. The student paused, paying careful attention. "No," he said slowly. "I don't taste any salt at all." The master sat beside his student on a smooth stone at the water's edge. His weathered hands reached out to clasp the young man's hands in profound tenderness. "My dear student," the master said, "the pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less. The amount of pain in existence remains constant, but the amount of bitterness we experience depends entirely on the container we put that pain into." The apprentice listened with new understanding. "When you are in pain," the master continued, "the only thing you can truly control is your response. You can choose to be a small glass where every grain of salt overwhelms your senses, or you can choose to enlarge your sense of things to become like this vast lake where the same salt dissolves harmlessly into something much greater." The master paused. "Stop being a glass, my friend. Become a lake. The Buddha once said, 'Pain is certain, suffering is optional.' This fundamental teaching reveals the heart of our relationship with difficulty. We cannot eliminate the challenges woven into human existence, but we have tremendous power over how that pain affects us. What emerges from this story is understanding about consciousness itself. Our awareness is not fixed in size. It can contract into the narrow confines of a glass, where every difficulty looms enormous, or it can expand into the spaciousness of a lake, where the same difficulties become manageable. Why do we often choose to be the glass rather than the lake? First is our tendency toward pain myopia, becoming so focused on discomfort that it fills our entire awareness. Second is our habit of story proliferation, taking a single, painful event and creating elaborate narratives about how unfair life is. Third is the comparing mind, measuring our pain against an imaginary standard of how life should be. The lake perspective doesn't minimize genuine pain or suggest passivity. Rather, it offers a skillful way of relating to inevitable challenges that doesn't compound them with unnecessary suffering. From lake consciousness, we can respond to problems more creatively because we're not overwhelmed. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." From the lake perspective, we remember that everything arises and passes away within the vast space of awareness. Today's crisis becomes tomorrow's memory. We become a lake through practices that naturally expand awareness. Meditation teaches us to rest in spacious presence. Gratitude helps us notice experiences beyond immediate difficulties. Service reminds us that our pain is part of shared human experience. Tonight, as you reflect on current challenges, can you sense the difference between experiencing them from glass consciousness versus lake consciousness? What would it feel like to allow your awareness to expand beyond the immediate intensity of difficulties to include the vast context of this moment? As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your mind, sit down and observe it. If your mind is clear, happiness will come. The clarity he speaks of is not the absence of salt, but the spaciousness to hold it skillfully. In becoming lakes rather than glasses, we discover that pain can become a gateway to deeper compassion and freedom. Now let us explore a story about the power of belief and the destiny we create through faith itself. This is the tale of the general and the coin that revealed truth. A Japanese general faced an impossible situation. His army was greatly outnumbered by enemy forces. The terrain favored his opponents, and by every conventional measure of military strategy, the coming battle should result in devastating defeat. Yet something deep within him remained convinced that victory was possible. Perhaps it was intuition, perhaps it was desperate hope, but he felt certain that his cause was just, and his troops, though fewer in number, possessed a fighting spirit that could overcome the odds. The problem was his soldiers. They could count as well as he could, and they had eyes to see the massive force arrayed against them. Fear rippled through their ranks like a contagion. Doubt clouded their faces. Whispered conversations filled with pessimism spread through the camp, and the general could sense that their morale was crumbling before the battle had even begun. He knew that an army convinced of its own defeat would indeed be defeated, regardless of any other factors. Technical skill, superior weapons, even numerical advantage means nothing when soldiers have already surrendered in their hearts. But an army that truly believed in its victory could accomplish seemingly impossible things through the sheer force of that conviction. On the morning of the battle, as they marched toward their destiny, the general led his troops to a small religious shrine that stood beside the road. This was a place where countless warriors had stopped over the centuries to pray before facing uncertain fate. The general gathered his men around him and led them in earnest prayer, asking for divine blessing and protection in the coming fight. When the prayers were finished, The general reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple coin. He held it high so that every soldier could see it clearly. "My brothers," he called out, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks. "We have prayed, and now we will let heaven itself reveal our destiny. I will toss this coin into the air. If it lands heads, we are fated to win this battle. If it lands tails, we are destined to lose. Let us discover what the gods have decided for us." The soldiers pressed closer, their breathing shallow with anticipation. Everything seemed to depend on this single moment, this one flip of metals spinning through the morning air. The general tossed the coin high, and every eye followed its arc as it rose, hung suspended for an instant against the sky, then fell back, down to earth. The coin landed and lay still in the dust. It was heads. A cheer erupted from the troops that could probably be heard for miles. Soldiers who had been grim and fearful moments before now laughed with joy and embraced each other with renewed confidence. The gods had spoken. Victory was assured. Their cause was blessed by heaven itself. Filled with this divine confidence, the soldiers attacked their enemies with such fierce determination and coordinated power that they achieved exactly what the coin had predicted. Against all odds, they won a decisive victory, routing forces much larger than their own and securing a triumph that would be remembered for generations. After the battle, as the general walked among his celebrating troops, his lieutenant approached him with wonder in his eyes. "General," the lieutenant said, "what an incredible thing. The coin revealed our true destiny, just as you said it would. Surely no human power can change what heaven has decreed." "You are absolutely right," the general replied with a knowing smile. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the coin, holding it so his lieutenant could examine it closely. "No one can change destiny." The lieutenant looked at the coin and gasped. Both sides showed heads. The Buddha once said, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become." Here we discover the profound truth that destiny is not something that happens to us, but something we create through the power of our own beliefs and expectations. Why do we so readily assume that fate is beyond our influence, when our own minds play such a crucial role in shaping what unfolds? Zen Buddhism teaches that while we cannot control all external circumstances, we have tremendous power over the internal conditions that determine how we respond to whatever arises. The general understood something profound about human psychology and the nature of reality itself. He knew that his soldiers' belief in victory was more important than their numerical disadvantage. He recognized that confidence, determination, and fighting spirit could overcome superior numbers when those qualities were genuinely present. But here's the deeper teaching. The general didn't simply manipulate his troops through deception. He created the conditions that allowed their natural courage and strength to emerge. The soldiers possessed the ability to fight brilliantly all along. They simply needed to believe in themselves and their cause. Consider your own relationship with destiny and possibility. How often do you assume that outcomes are predetermined, that success or failure is beyond your influence? The general's two-headed coin represents the power we all possess to tip the scales in favor of positive outcomes through the quality of our engagement with life. This doesn't mean we can control everything through positive thinking, or that believing in something makes it automatically true. The soldiers still had to fight the battle. They still had to demonstrate actual skill and courage. But their belief in victory created the psychological conditions that allowed their best qualities to manifest. In Zen practice, we learn to work skillfully with both effort and surrender, both intention and acceptance. We recognize that while we cannot dictate specific outcomes, we can profoundly influence the energy and attention we bring to any situation. This quality of engagement often determines whether we experience success or failure, regardless of external circumstances. Zen Master Huang Po taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." The general was wise enough to see that his soldiers' thoughts about the battle were more influential than their thoughts about their numerical disadvantage. He worked with the reality of psychology rather than fighting against it. Look deeply at the various challenges and opportunities in your own life. Where might you be carrying a tails mentality, assuming defeat before you fully engaged, focusing on obstacles rather than possibilities, letting fear determine your level of effort? And where might you need to create your own two-headed coin, a practice or perspective that consistently orients you toward positive engagement regardless of circumstances? The Buddha taught, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This isn't magical thinking, but recognition of the creative power of consciousness itself. When we approach situations with genuine confidence, clarity, and commitment, we often discover capabilities we didn't know we possessed. Tonight, as you consider the battles you're facing and the outcomes you're hoping for, can you find your own version of the general's wisdom? Can you create internal conditions that support your highest possibilities rather than your deepest fears? Can you recognize that while you cannot control destiny, you have profound influence over the beliefs and attitudes that shape how destiny unfolds through you? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. The general's confidence lit the flame of belief in every soldier's heart. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is create the conditions that allow others and ourselves to discover the strength that was there all along. Let us now turn to a story about the relationship between outer circumstances and inner cultivation. This is the tale of the horse and the mind. In a remote mountain region where execution grounds served as sobering reminders of mortality, Zen Master Bankai sought to test the depth of his spiritual realization. For several nights, he sat in meditation beneath a wooden crucifix, using the proximity of death to penetrate more deeply into the nature of existence. After completing this intense retreat, Bankai made his way to a nearby area where he could rest. He found a peaceful spot on an embankment surrounding a horse corral where he lay down to continue his contemplation under the open sky. As he rested there, absorbed in profound silence, a harsh sound shattered his peace. From within the corral came the violent sounds of a warrior brutally beating his horse. The animal's cries mixed with the sharp crack of a whip and angry shouts of a man losing control. Master Bankai observed this scene with growing concern. The warrior was clearly frustrated, taking out his inner turmoil on the innocent animal. Each blow seemed to make the horse more agitated rather than more compliant, creating a vicious cycle of violence and resistance. Unable to remain silent, Bankai called out from his position, "Hey, what do you think you are doing?" The warrior, absorbed in rage, ignored the interruption and continued his harsh treatment. The beating intensified, and so did Bankai's concern for both the animal and the man degrading himself through such cruelty. "Hey!" Bankei called out again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years cultivating inner peace. "What do you think you are doing?" Still, the warrior continued, lost in frustration and anger. The horse became increasingly panicked, which only seemed to fuel the man's determination to force compliance through violence. A third time, Bankai's voice rang out. "Hey! What do you think you are doing?" This time, something in the master's tone penetrated the warrior's rage. The man stopped his beating, climbed down from his horse, and approached the embankment. As he drew closer, his expression changed. There was something about this stranger that commanded respect, a quality of presence that spoke of deep, inner development. "You were yelling at me," the warrior said, his voice still carrying traces of anger, but now mixed with curiosity. "Do you have something to tell me?" Bankei looked at the man with compassion, seeing not an enemy, but someone caught in the same cycles of frustration that trap us all. His response was simple yet profound. "Rather than beat your horse for being unruly, why not chastise yourself and train your own mind right?" The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge connecting two very different approaches to dealing with difficulty. The warrior had been trying to solve his problem through external force and control. Bankei was pointing to an entirely different possibility. As the Buddha observed, conquer anger with non-anger, conquer badness with goodness, conquer meanness with generosity, conquer dishonesty with truth. This teaching captures the essence of what Bankei offered the frustrated warrior. The recognition that our external struggles mirror our internal state. What emerges from this story is the profound insight that we cannot successfully force the world to conform to our expectations through aggression or control. The warrior's approach, beating the horse into submission, represents how we often try to manage difficult circumstances in our own lives. We become frustrated with external conditions and respond with force, criticism, or manipulation, never recognizing that the real work lies within. Why do we instinctively blame external circumstances for our frustration? Buddhist psychology explains that the untrained mind seeks to maintain its comfort by controlling its environment, rather than developing the flexibility to respond skillfully to whatever arises. This creates what Zen calls pushing the river, exhausting ourselves, trying to force reality to match our preferences. Consider how this pattern manifests in daily life. The computer that crashes during an important project becomes the target of our anger, when the real issue is our attachment to having technology work perfectly. The traffic jam that makes us late triggers road rage, when the actual problem is our expectation that travel should always be smooth. The family member who doesn't respond to our advice becomes the focus of our frustration, when the deeper issue is our need to control others' choices. In each case, we're like the warrior beating the horse, applying force to external circumstances while ignoring the internal conditions that create our suffering. The horse represents the uncontrollable aspects of life: other people's behavior, natural events, technological failures, and the inherent unpredictability of existence. Zen teacher Pema Chodron writes, "You are the sky, everything else is just the weather." This points to the same truth Bankei offered the warrior. Instead of trying to control the weather of external circumstances, we can develop the spacious awareness that remains calm regardless of conditions. The real training involves learning to work with our own minds, rather than trying to force compliance from the world around us. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations, but rather approaching challenges from a place of inner stability rather than reactive frustration. Buddhist practice offers specific techniques for this internal training. Mindfulness meditation teaches us to observe our reactive patterns without being swept away by them. Loving kindness practice develops compassion for ourselves and others when things don't go as planned. Contemplation of impermanence helps us accept the changeable nature of all conditions. Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable frustrations of daily life, can you remember Bankai's teaching? When you find yourself wanting to beat the horse of difficult circumstances, can you pause and ask, what would it mean to train my own mind instead? Buddha's wisdom teaches us, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. The path to peace lies not in conquering external conditions, but in cultivating the inner qualities that remain stable, regardless of what the world presents. Our next story reveals the power of returning to what is real when fear threatens to overwhelm us. This is the tale of the captured warrior. In ancient Japan, during a time of constant warfare between rival clans, a skilled warrior found himself on the losing side of a fierce battle. As his comrades fell around him and defeat became inevitable, he was captured by enemy soldiers and dragged away from the battlefield, his armor stripped, his weapons confiscated. That evening, they threw him into a dark, cramped prison cell with stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through his bones. As darkness settled over the prison, the warrior's mind began to race with terrifying possibilities. Tomorrow, they would come for him. He knew the customs of war. First would come the interrogation, designed to extract information about his lord's defenses, troop movements, and strategic plans. When he refused to speak, as honor demanded, they would resort to torture. Hot iron, bamboo splinters under his fingernails, methods he had heard described in hushed tones by other warriors. And when they had extracted what they could, or when they grew tired of his silence, would come the execution. As these thoughts consumed him, his heart began to pound so violently he feared it might burst. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Sleep seemed impossible as his mind conjured increasingly vivid scenarios of tomorrow's suffering. Hours passed in this torment. The warrior paced his small cell, sat against the cold stone wall, lay on the straw-covered floor. Nothing brought relief from the visions of impending doom that played repeatedly in his mind like a terrible dream he couldn't escape. Then, in the depths of his despair, he remembered the gentle voice of his Zen master back at the monastery where he had studied before becoming a warrior. The old teacher's words came to him as clearly as if the master were sitting beside him in the cell. Tomorrow is not real. It is an illusion. The only reality is now. At first, the warrior's frightened mind resisted these words. How could tomorrow be an illusion when the threats were so concrete, so inevitable? But as he sat quietly and allowed the teaching to penetrate deeper, something began to shift. He noticed his breathing. In this moment, he was breathing freely. He felt the straw beneath him, rough but not uncomfortable. He heard the sound of wind moving through the trees outside his window, a sound that spoke of the natural world, continuing its ancient rhythms regardless of human conflict. In this moment, he was not being tortured. In this moment, he was not dying. In this moment, there was simply a man sitting in a cell, alive and aware. The terrors that had seemed so overwhelming moments before revealed themselves to be nothing more than thoughts about a future that existed only in his imagination. As this understanding deepened, a profound peace settled over the warrior. His breathing slowed and deepened. His racing heart found a steady rhythm. For the first time since his capture, he smiled. The master's wisdom had freed him from a prison far more confining than the stone walls around him, the prison of anxious thoughts about tomorrow. Within minutes, the warrior fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound truth the warrior discovered in his cell. The only moment in which we ever actually live is this one. Why do we torture ourselves with endless scenarios about the future? Zen Buddhism explains that our minds evolved as survival mechanisms, constantly scanning for threats and planning for protection. While this capacity serves us in genuine emergencies, it becomes a source of suffering when we mistake mental projections for reality. Look deeply at your own experience. How much of your anxiety stems from vivid imaginings of future scenarios that may never occur? The presentation you're worried about, the medical test results you're awaiting, the difficult conversation you need to have. These situations exist primarily in thought, not in present reality. The warrior's teaching shows us that we can acknowledge future challenges without being consumed by them. Planning and preparation have their place, but when they transform into obsessive worry, they rob us of peace and clarity. As Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. The future remains unwritten, shaped by causes and conditions we cannot fully predict or control. The worried mind assumes that current difficulties will inevitably continue or worsen, but impermanence teaches us that everything changes. The warrior in his cell could not know what the next day would actually bring. Perhaps his lord's forces would mount a rescue. Perhaps his captors would show mercy. Perhaps diplomatic negotiations would secure his release. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "The past is gone, the future is not yet here, and there is only one moment for you to live." This teaching doesn't encourage us to ignore future responsibilities or avoid reasonable planning. Instead, it invites us to recognize where our attention habitually goes and to gently guide it back to the richness of present experience. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called beginner's mind, approaching each moment with fresh awareness rather than predetermined anxiety. When we truly inhabit the present, we often discover that it contains resources for peace and clarity that worried thinking never revealed. Consider how the warrior's shift in attention transformed his entire experience. The same cell, the same uncertain future, but by returning to present moment awareness, suffering transformed into peace. This transformation is available to us in every moment of anxiety or fear. Tonight, as you notice your mind creating stories about tomorrow's challenges, remember the captured warrior and his master's wisdom. What is actually happening right now? What simple experiences, breathing, sitting, the temperature of the air, are available to anchor you in reality rather than imagination? As the Buddha taught, do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. In this teaching lies the key to the warrior's prison and our own. Now, let us explore a story about fearlessness and the power that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. This is the encounter between the general and the Zen master who could not be moved. During the violent civil wars that tore through feudal Japan, armies swept across the countryside like natural disasters, conquering villages and controlling territories through force and intimidation. When word spread that a particular warlord's army was approaching, most people would flee with whatever possessions they could carry, seeking safety in the mountains or with relatives in distant towns. In one small village, as the dreaded army drew near, the familiar pattern repeated itself. Families packed hastily, merchants closed their shops, and within hours, the streets that had been busy with daily life stood empty and silent. Everyone had fled. Everyone, that is, except the old Zen master who lived in the simple temple at the village center. When the conquering army arrived and found the village deserted, the general was surprised to discover smoke still rising from the temple chimney. Curious about who would have the audacity, or perhaps the foolishness, to remain when everyone else had fled, he decided to investigate this anomaly personally. The general approached the temple with several of his lieutenants, expecting to find either a frail old man too weak to flee, or perhaps someone who had been unable to escape in time. What he found instead was the Zen master sitting peacefully in his garden, tending to his plants as if nothing unusual was happening around him. The general had grown accustomed to fear and submission wherever his army went. Village leaders would prostrate themselves before him, pleading for mercy and offering tribute in hopes of avoiding destruction. Citizens would cower and flee at the mere sight of his soldiers. This old man's calm indifference to his presence was both puzzling and irritating. When he wasn't treated with the deference and submissiveness to which he was accustomed, the general's face darkened with growing anger. Here was someone who didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation or respect the power he represented. "You fool!" the general shouted, his voice echoing through the empty courtyard as he reached for his sword. His elaborate armor gleamed menacingly in the afternoon light, and his hand gripped his weapon with practiced ease. "Don't you realize that you are standing before a man who could run you through without blinking an eye?" The threat that had terrorized countless others left the master completely unmoved. He continued his careful tending of a small flowering bush, his hands steady and his expression serene. When he finally looked up at the general, it was with the same calm attention he had shown before, as if greeting any ordinary visitor to his garden. "And do you realize," the master replied with perfect equanimity, "that you are standing before a man who can be run through without blinking an eye?" The general stood speechless, his sword half drawn. His anger suddenly dissolved into something approaching awe. In all his years of warfare and conquest, he had encountered many forms of courage. The desperate bravery of cornered soldiers, the defiant rage of defeated enemies, the foolish boldness of young warriors. But he had never encountered anything like this. Complete acceptance without fear. Total peace in the face of death. The master's response revealed something the general had never considered, that there could be a power greater than the ability to kill, and that was the complete absence of fear about being killed. Here was someone who had so fully accepted the temporary nature of existence that even the threat of immediate death held no power over him. Slowly, the general returned his sword to its sheath. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the temple, leaving the master to continue his gardening in peace. The village remained untouched by the war, not because of any military strategy or negotiated protection, but because of one man's absolute fearlessness. As the Buddha taught, All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. Here we discover the profound power that emerges when we fully accept this fundamental truth, rather than spending our lives trying to escape it. Why does complete acceptance of mortality create such presence and authority? Zen Buddhism reveals that most of our fear comes not from external threats, but from our desperate clinging to what is inherently temporary. When that clinging dissolves, the threats themselves lose their power to disturb our inner peace. The general's power came from others' fear of death and loss, but someone who has fully accepted the temporary nature of existence cannot be threatened with what he has already willingly released. The master's fearlessness wasn't bravado or indifference. It was the natural result of understanding impermanence so completely that even his own death held no terror. Consider your own relationship with threats and intimidation in daily life. How much of your fear comes from attachment to maintaining your current circumstances, preserving your reputation, or protecting your physical comfort? The master's response suggests that true invulnerability comes not from being untouchable, but from having nothing that can be taken away. This doesn't mean being passive or welcoming harm. The master wasn't seeking death or encouraging violence. Rather, his complete acceptance of mortality's inevitability freed him from the paralyzing fear that controls most people when facing genuine danger. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." The master's single response contained more power than any threat because it came from a place of absolute acceptance rather than resistance or fear. Tonight, as you consider the various pressures and threats you face, can you remember the master's profound response to the general's sword? Can you find the space where acceptance of impermanence creates not resignation, but a kind of unshakable presence that cannot be intimidated? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, the whole secret of existence is to have no fear. True freedom comes not from avoiding danger, but from understanding so completely that we cannot ultimately be harmed, that external threats become powerless to disturb our essential peace. Now, let us explore a story about the paradoxical nature of spiritual seeing and the limits of conceptual understanding. This is the teaching of 3 strikes and deeper vision. In the mountain monastery, where the 6th patriarch Hui Neng taught, students came from across China to study with the master, whose realization was said to surpass all others of his time. Among these seekers was a brilliant young monk named Shen Hui, known for his sharp intellect and probing questions. Unlike many students who approached the patriarch with humble requests for basic instruction, Shen Hui often challenged the master with sophisticated philosophical inquiries. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the monastery windows and the air carried the peaceful sounds of monks going about their daily practice, Shen Hui found the 6th patriarch sitting quietly in the main hall. The master's posture was perfectly still, his breathing soft and natural, his expression serene yet alert, the embodiment of meditation in action. Seeing an opportunity to test his understanding against the master's realization, Shen Hui approached with a question that had been forming in his mind during his own meditation practice. The nature of perception during spiritual practice had become a source of great curiosity and confusion for him. "Hi, Master," Shen Hui said, bowing respectfully but speaking with the confidence of someone who believed his question particularly insightful. "When you sit in meditation, do you see or not?" To Shen Hui, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable inquiry into the mechanics of enlightened awareness. Did awakened consciousness involve special kinds of seeing? Did meditation reveal mystical visions or higher perceptions unavailable to ordinary minds? Or did true realization transcend seeing altogether, existing in some pure state beyond sensory experience? What he received in response was completely unexpected. Without warning, the sixth patriarch picked up his wooden teaching stick and struck Shen Hui 3 times in rapid succession, not gently, but with enough force that the blows stung sharply and left the young monk both physically uncomfortable and mentally bewildered. "When I hit you," the patriarch asked with the same calm tone one might use to discuss the weather, "does it hurt or not?" Shen Hui rubbed his smarting shoulders, his mind racing to understand what had just occurred. The question seemed simple enough, yet something about the context made him suspect that a straightforward answer might be inadequate. The physical sensation was undeniable, yet the spiritual implications felt complex. "It both does and does not hurt," he replied carefully, intuiting that the master was pointing towards some paradox beyond ordinary logic. "I both see and do not see," the sixth patriarch responded, his words carrying the weight of direct experience rather than philosophical speculation. But Shen Hui's intellect wasn't satisfied with paradox. He needed to understand the mechanics, to categorize and explain this teaching in terms his conceptual mind could grasp. "How can you both see and not see?" he pressed, genuine confusion evident in his voice. "That seems contradictory. Either you see during meditation or you don't. How can both be true simultaneously?" The patriarch's response came with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping students move beyond the limitations of dualistic thinking. "What I see," he explained with gentle clarity, "are the waverings and wanderings of my own mind. What I do not see is the right and wrong and good and bad of other people. This is my seeing and not seeing." With these words, the entire teaching crystallized. The master wasn't speaking about mystical visions or transcendent states, but about the fundamental shift in perception that accompanies genuine spiritual maturity. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, the mind is everything. What you think, you become. This teaching relates profoundly to the patriarch's lesson about the nature of awakened seeing. Why do we become confused when spiritual teachings transcend ordinary logic? Zen Buddhism explains that our conceptual mind operates through dualistic categories, seeing or not seeing, pain or no pain, right or wrong. But enlightened awareness doesn't eliminate these experiences. It transforms our relationship to them. The deeper teaching here shows us what authentic spiritual perception actually involves. The patriarch sees his own mental processes clearly, the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and reactions. This isn't a mystical power, but the natural result of sustained mindfulness practice. He observes the waverings and wanderings of consciousness without being lost in them. Simultaneously, he doesn't see in the judgmental sense, imposing categories of right and wrong, good and bad onto others' behavior. This non-seeing isn't ignorance, but wisdom, recognizing that such judgments often say more about the observer than the observed. Look deeply at your own patterns of perception. How much of what you think you see in others actually reflects your own mental projections? When someone irritates you, are you seeing their actual behavior clearly, or are you seeing your own triggers and reactions? When someone impresses you, are you recognizing their genuine qualities, Or are you seeing your own desires for approval or achievement? This ancient wisdom illuminates the difference between reactive perception and clear seeing. Reactive perception involves our past conditioning, our emotional needs, our judgmental habits. Clear seeing involves awareness that recognizes its own processes while remaining open to what's actually present. Zen master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." This teaching points to the same insight the patriarch offered. True seeing involves turning attention toward our own mental processes rather than fixating on external judgments and evaluations. The 3 strikes Shen Hui received weren't punishment, but skillful teaching. Physical pain that both does and does not hurt points toward the mystery of conscious experience itself. Pain arises in awareness, is felt fully, yet doesn't define or limit the awareness that experiences it. Similarly, thoughts and emotions arise in consciousness without contaminating its essential clarity. Consider how this teaching might transform your daily experience. Instead of constantly evaluating others' behavior, finding fault, making comparisons, generating opinions, what if you turned that same attention toward observing your own mental reactions? What patterns would you discover in the wanderings and waverings of your own mind? This doesn't mean we become passive or lose our capacity for discernment. Rather, we develop the ability to respond from clarity rather than reactivity. When we see our own judgmental tendencies clearly, we naturally become less caught in them. When we observe our mental projections, we're less likely to mistake them for objective reality. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called mirror mind, awareness that reflects whatever arises without being stained or changed by it. This mirror sees everything clearly while maintaining its essential emptiness and openness. Tonight, as you notice your mind categorizing and judging the experiences of your day, can you remember the patriarch's teaching? Can you turn your attention toward the seer rather than constantly evaluating what is seen? Can you discover the freedom that comes from seeing your own mental processes without being enslaved by them? Buddha spoke of this when he said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." By learning to see our own mental patterns with compassion rather than judgment, we develop the clarity to see others with equal kindness and understanding. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about contentment and the nature of desire. This is the stonecutter's journey. High in the mountain villages, there lived a simple stonecutter who had discovered the secret of happiness without knowing it. Each dawn, he would climb winding paths to the quarries, his tools balanced across his shoulders. As he worked among the stones, he would sing old mountain songs that echoed across the valleys. Though he was poor by society's measures, living in a modest hut with few possessions, the stonecutter desired nothing more than what he had. His simple life felt complete. The rhythm of his work, the beauty of the mountains, the satisfaction of honest labor. His heart held not a care in the world. One day, he was called to work on the grand mansion of a wealthy nobleman. As he approached the estate, his eyes widened at the magnificence before him. Marble columns reached toward the sky, gardens sprawled in perfect symmetry. For the first time in his life, the stonecutter felt the sharp pang of desire pierce his contentment. "If only I were rich," he sighed. "Then I would not have to earn my living in sweat and toil as I do now." To his amazement, a voice whispered from the stones, "Your wish has been granted. Henceforth, anything you desire will be given to you." He returned home that evening to find his humble hut replaced by a mansion as magnificent as the nobleman's. Overwhelmed with joy, he abandoned his tools and began enjoying the luxurious life of the wealthy. But one hot afternoon, gazing from his ornate window, he saw the king's royal procession passing by. The monarch sat in cool shade, surrounded by noblemen and servants, appearing serene and powerful above the common heat. "How I wish I were a king myself," he thought, and immediately found himself reclining in silk cushions within the royal carriage. But the carriage proved warmer than expected. Even through thick walls, the sun's heat penetrated relentlessly. "I wish I were the sun," he declared, and found himself sending waves of light and heat across the universe. As the sun, he felt magnificent and all-powerful until thick storm clouds gathered, completely blocking his rays. "I wish to be a cloud." And so he became a massive storm cloud, glorying in his power to block the sun. But as he transformed into falling rain, he encountered an enormous rock that blocked his path completely. "A mere rock more powerful than I? I wish to be a rock." Suddenly, he stood tall upon the mountainside, feeling he had achieved true permanence. But soon, he heard chipping sounds at his base. Looking down, he saw a tiny human figure cutting chunks of stone away. "A puny creature more powerful than me! I want to be a man again!" And so he found himself once more a stone cutter, climbing familiar mountain paths. But now something had changed. As he shaped stones and felt mountain breezes, his heart swelled with deep contentment. His song returned, richer than before, because he had learned to be content with exactly who he was. The Buddha once said, "Health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth." This ancient wisdom illuminates the endless cycle of wanting that keeps us from recognizing the abundance already present in our lives. Why do we chase after different conditions, always believing happiness lies in the next transformation? Each desire fulfilled only reveals the next desire, creating an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. The stonecutter's journey reveals the futility of seeking happiness through external circumstances. Consider your own versions of this cycle. "I'll be happy when I get promoted," only to discover new stresses. "I'll be content with more money," only to find greater wealth brings new worries. Each achievement reveals the next mountain to climb. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi said, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox points to the heart of contentment, the ability to fully accept what is, while still engaging wholeheartedly with life's natural changes. The stonecutter's final transformation wasn't into something greater, but into appreciation for what he had always been. His work remained the same, but his relationship to life was completely transformed. Contentment isn't found in having different experiences, but in bringing different awareness to whatever experiences arise. Tonight, as you notice the mind's habitual reaching toward what's not here, can you experiment with the stonecutter's final wisdom? Can you find the song that emerges when you stop trying to be anything other than what you are? As the Buddha taught, contentment is natural wealth, luxury is artificial poverty. The greatest transformation available isn't becoming something different, but recognizing the inherent completeness of what we already are. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between resistance and flow. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a swift river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, observing the interplay between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, contemplative man who seemed to understand something profound about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river swelled with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky gorge below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging torrent and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who witnessed his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and swift for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in anguish as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream, once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the base of the waterfall, they saw the old man emerging from the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had witnessed. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and considered their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I accommodated myself to the water, not the water to me. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself, and this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a fortunate accident. They had seen a demonstration of a profound principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful observation of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents, rather than exhausting ourselves in futile resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we instinctively fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adaptation might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control external conditions through force of will. But this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck. It was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of existence itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events, rather than demanding that life conform to our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Consider your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach, not passive submission, but conscious adaptation that maintains our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean accepting harmful situations or abandoning our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, control other people's behavior, or make external circumstances conform to our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through accommodation rather than force. Zen master Lao Tzu taught, "Water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which cannot yield and is destroyed." The old man embodied this teaching, demonstrating that apparent weakness can be a source of tremendous strength when applied with wisdom. The Buddha said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to accommodate yourself to the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to maintain your center while flowing with forces you cannot change, discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything while maintaining our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. As our shared journey comes to a gentle conclusion, simply notice the quality of this present moment. Feel the quiet that remains when the stories have ended, a stillness that was not created, but simply revealed. The profound calm you can touch right now is not a treasure you have found, but the very foundation of your own being, patiently waiting beneath the shifting sands of thought. The Buddha taught, even as a solid rock is unshaken by the wind, so are the wise unshaken by praise or blame. This is the quiet truth that has resonated through each of the profound Buddhist stories we've shared to find peace tonight. The winds of life, our worries, our plans, the endless commentary of the mind are ceaseless. The narratives were not about stopping this wind, but about discovering the unshakable rock of awareness within. Each one was a lesson in finding that internal anchor, that deep-seated stability that is unmoved by the passing weather of our experience. Even now, if the mind offers another thought, you don't have to be carried away by it. The wisdom cultivated here is the understanding that you are not the wind, you are the rock. This recognition is now a more familiar space for you, a quiet refuge you can return to again and again. As you settle deeper into stillness, allow yourself to feel this unshakable quality. Sense the groundedness in your body and the space that surrounds your thoughts. This is the essence of true rest. Not striving for a state, but resting in the state that is already here. In the silence that follows my voice, simply be with the feeling of this solid center, observing the gentle rhythm of your breath as it flows on its own. These teachings are a timeless reminder of the strength that lies in non-reaction. They point to a freedom that is always available when we stop letting the outside world dictate our inner peace. As you drift from this quiet space into the rest of your night and onward into your day, may you carry this sense of unshakable calm with you. Let it be the silent ground that supports you, steady and true, through all of life's moments. Thank you for joining us on this journey at Sleepy Monk. Sleep well.